All right. Welcome everyone. I hope you're doing well. Good morning. Now, in our previous lecture, we had talked about the formation of the Indian National Congress. We had also discussed the debate regarding it. The formation of the Congress marked the true beginning of the Indian national movement, which evolved over several phases. These include the earliest one being the moderate phase. Moderate phase is also known as the liberal phase of Indian nationalism. Time period 1885, inception of the Congress, up to the beginning of the 20th century, that is 1905. Okay. The second one is known as the extremist phase. Now, the ideology of political extremism had been present in the national movement from its very beginning, but within the Congress, extremism emerged as the dominant force following the beginning of the Swadeshi movement. So, 1905 up to the beginning of the Gandhian phase, that is the launching of the Khilafat non-cooperation movement, that is 1919. Okay. Now, an offshoot of the extremist phase following the failure of the Swadeshi movement was the emergence of revolutionary extremism, where instead of mass protests, dharnas, lockouts, strikes, or constitutional methods of protest such as prayers, petitions, and protests, etc., the philosophy of guns and bombs was dominant. This is known as the phase of revolutionary extremism, ठीक है, or revolutionary terrorism. Now, the revolutionary movement was not a part of the mainstream national movement. As always, it involved certain illegal activities, thus it would neither enjoy mass support nor open politics. Rather, it was an undercurrent within the national movement. Two distinct phases of revolutionary activity were visible in India during the national movement. The first, from the failure of the Swadeshi movement, that is 1907, up to the end of the First World War, 1918, following which there was a reduction in revolutionary activity for roughly 4 or 5 years before revolutionary extremism was revived in the 1920s following the failure of the non-cooperation movement. That is 1924, and this phase remained active till the beginning of the civil disobedience movement, 1930. Clear hai? Now, following the extremist movement within mainstream nationalist politics, there was emergence of Gandhian politics. This involved the Congress being led directly or indirectly by Mahatma Gandhi and launching a series of massive mass movements, true all India mass movements, beginning from 1919 right up to independence. However, with the passage of time, other trends also started emerging within the nationalist movement. One major change in global history was the Bolshevik Revolution, following which the socialist ideology became quite prominent across the world. It was especially attractive to anti colonial leaders because inherent within it was the message of anti imperialism. And thus, the socialist phase also emerged. Now, in the context of India, while socialism had started attracting some nationalists from the very earliest, but in the real sense, it emerged as a potent force following the Purna Swaraj Resolution 1929, and it continued to guide the values of the national movement right up to independence 1947. And then finally, we have the destructive ideology of communal nationalism. Now, communalism within Indian politics had been a reality almost ever since the end of the Great Revolt of 1857. Because of the activities of individuals such as Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and to a lesser degree Bal Gangadhar Tilak and Madan Mohan Malviya, etc., communal politics continued to grow within the mainstream national movement. One major breakthrough for the communal nationalists was the formation of the All India Muslim League, and the other one was the formation of the All India Hindu Mahasabha. However, there was still hope for common action. Hindus and Muslims were ready to cooperate with each other, which was amply demonstrated through developments such as the Lucknow Pact. However, this compact between the Muslim League, Hindu Mahasabha, and the Congress was not based on very solid footing. Therefore, it was bound to fail sooner or later. The first breach in this relationship came in the backdrop of the Nehru report, where Muslim League objected to some of the provisions of the Nehru report, some of the demands of the Nehru report. However, even now, the Muslim League never supported the agenda of a communal, openly communal rhetoric and communal violence. That would change in the backdrop of the UP elections, UP Assembly elections of 1937, when the true phase of communal politics emerged in India. तो शुरुआत तो उसको हम बहुत मतलब कई सारे उसके एपिसोड्स को पॉइंट आउट कर सकते हैं, बट रियल बिगिनिंग ऑफ कम्युनल पॉलिटिक्स, कम्युनल नेशनलिज्म स्टार्टेड with the breakdown of relationships between the Congress and Muslim League following the assembly elections of 1937. This breach finally matured from the side of the Muslim League in the form of the Pakistan demand, which was raised in 1940, and a long series of communal violence, communal riots, which took place from this period right up to independence, resulting in the simultaneous independence as well as partition of India. ठीक है, तो ये ब्रॉडली हम अलग अलग फेजेस में नेशनल मूवमेंट की हिस्ट्री को डिवाइड कर सकते हैं. इज दिस मच क्लियर? नाउ फर्स्ट वी हैव टू एड्रेस द मॉडरेट फेज ऑफ nationalist politics. क्या था ये फेज? इट रेफर्स टू द earliest phase of nationalist politics. wherein the Congress was dominated by moderate liberals and put forward moderate demands using moderate methods. ठीक है? So leaders were also moderates, demands were also moderate, and methods were also moderate. Thus, it is known as the moderate phase of Indian politics. The moderate leaders came from the Indian upper middle class. They were Western in their tastes, morals, opinions, and intellects. In other words, they were admirers of Western ideals, such as parliamentary democracy, such as limited government, such as secularism, such as popular sovereignty, and separation of powers. ठीक है? These leaders believed that on the whole, British rule, is it harmful for India or beneficial for Indians? It is beneficial for Indians. Thus, they were pro-British. Was politics a full-time occupation for them or a part-time one? It was a part-time one. The bulk of the moderate leaders were accomplished professionals in their own right, coming primarily from the legal profession, but some other professions were also represented heavily, such as medicine, journalism, education, etc. So they were urban professionals. And hence they were part-time politicians. They believed that India as of yet was not ready for major reforms, for complete autonomy or independence. They believed that Indians needed to first apprentice under the British tutelage. They believed that Indians would first have to prepare themselves for self-rule, and only when that has been achieved would they graduate their demands, right? So their agenda was not to introduce radical reforms. Rather, they wanted gradual reforms. So they are known either as gradualists or incrementalists. Further, they believed that the Indian masses as of yet were not ready for political participation. They were still driven by parochial values such as caste, religion, language, etc. Thus, they would first have to be modernized. So, towards the masses, they did not have much faith. Rather, they saw themselves as the educators of public opinion, as the educators of the masses through their writing, speeches, newspapers, articles, etc. They wanted to create political awareness among the masses. So they had no faith in mass politics. Right? Now, while they were admirers of Western ideals and British rule, they considered British rule to be beneficial for Indians on the whole. They also realized that British rule was causing certain problems. British rule had a long history of causing misery to Indians. However, for this, they did not blame the British rule as a whole. Rather, they blamed certain uninformed, misguided British officials on the ground in India. Therefore, between the British officials and the people of India, they perceived themselves as acting like a bridge, okay, as an interlocutor. They simply wanted to inform the British about the suffering of Indians, and they believed that since British rule is inherently good for Indians, natural response क्या होगा ब्रिटिश का towards the Indians, towards these problems, to solve them. So they saw themselves as an interlocutor between the British Raj and Indians. ठीक है? क्लियर? तो ये हो गया इनका लीडरशिप, एंटायरली मॉडरेट. Similarly, their demands were also moderate. They did not want any radical change. They never demanded Swaraj, self rule, or complete independence, Poon Swaraj. Rather, they simply demanded constitutional and administrative reforms in a gradual manner. Their demands included things such as expansion of the legislatures, the Indianization of the legislature and civil services, reduction in civilian and military expenditure, increase in service sector expenditure, reduction in land revenue, reduction in export duties, increase in import duties. They wanted protection for the peasants from exploitation of the zamindars. They wanted protection for the Indian industries. They demanded the introduction of electoral politics in India. They wanted to democratize the system of both central as well as provincial administration. right? So these were the kinds of things that they demanded. And similarly, their methods were also moderate. Since they did not want to engage the masses, that means extra constitutional political methods were out of the question. Things such as dharnas, rallies, protests, boycotts, passive resistance, they were never a part of the arsenal of the moderate leaders. Rather, the moderate confined themselves only to the use of constitutional methods of protest. तो इनको 3P मेथड भी बोलते हैं. क्या होते हैं ये? प्रेयर्स, petitions and protests, right? So the moderate leaders, in a very mild manner with very polite language, always in a very deferential tone, are going to make polite appeals to the colonial administrators to introduce certain reforms which they perceive are in the wider interests of all Indians, right? तो इस मेथड के थ्रू अंग्रेजों को कन्विंस करने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं दैट सर्टेन रिफॉर्म्स मस्ट बी इंट्रोड्यूस्ड. ठीक है, तो ये तो हो गया एक ओवरऑल आउटलुक ऑफ द मॉडरेट्स. समझ में आया है क्या है? Now the prominent moderate leaders, हम इनमें किन के नाम इंक्लूड कर सकते हैं? कैन यू नेम सम? कुछ मॉडरेट लीडर्स के नाम पता होंगे. दादा भाई नारोजी, जस्टिस एमजी राणा डे, गोपाल कृष्ण गोखले, फिरोज शाह मेहता, आरसी दत्त, दिनशा वाचा, etc. Right? So these were the prominent moderate leaders. इतना समझ में आया है? Now coming to their specific demands and objectives. Did the moderates ever demand Swaraj? No. Rather, they demanded gradual constitutional and administrative reforms, such as expansion of the legislature and its इंडियनाइजेशन. ठीक है, तो मतलब क्या हुआ कि जो लॉ मेकिंग प्रोसेस है उसको और रोबस्ट करने की जरूरत है. दैट मीन्स the law making powers of the governors or the governor generals that have to be reduced and a more representative system has to be introduced. And since laws are being made to govern India, तो क्या डिमांड किया? लेजिस्लेचर में इंडियंस होने चाहिए. इंडियनाइजेशन ऑफ द लेजिस्लेचर शुड टेक प्लेस. सेकेंडली, in order to make the democratic process more representative, they are going to demand the democratization of the electoral process. That means जो Indians के representatives हैं in legislatures में who are going to hold the government to account, they should be elected by the people that they are supposed to represent. ऐसा नहीं होना चाहिए कि सरकार उनको ऊपर से टपका दे Indians पर, right? So they should not be government appointees, rather they should be elected officials. So they also demanded the expansion of representative democracy. Thirdly, they demanded the Indianization of the civil service. Right? Why? Two major causes. The civil service was supposed to act as the first point of contact between the government and the subjects. And if the civil servants were Indians, they would be better able to appreciate the problems and aspirations of the people that they are supposed to serve. A European civil servant would have difficulty in doing this. And thus, to make the administration more sensitive and sympathetic to the people that it is supposed to serve, they demanded Indianization of the service. इसका एक दूसरा फायदा भी होगा क्या? अंग्रेज को बहुत ज्यादा सैलरी लगेगी देनी पड़ेगी एंड दिस वुड बलून द सिविल सर्विसेज सैलरी एंड पेंशन एक्सपेंडिचर. इंडियंस could अगर इंडियंस को रिक्रूट करते हैं then the wage bill could be reduced and the economies made by doing this could be spent towards other more necessary items such as social service expenditure, primary health care, education, road infrastructure. ये सब बनाने में वो पैसा जा सकता है. अच्छा, इसको करना कैसे है? How to Indianize the civil service? So they gave a method for that also by reforming the civil services examination. सिविल सर्विसेज एग्जामिनेशन में अकॉर्डिंग टू द मॉडरेट्स दो मेजर खामियां थी. एक क्या कि एग्जामिनेशन केवल इंग्लैंड में होता था, इंडिया में नहीं होता था. सो दे डिमांडेड simultaneous civil services examinations in both Britain as well as India. एंड दूसरी खामी क्या थी? The syllabus, the curriculum was heavily anglicized, heavily Europeanized. This naturally eliminated the bulk of Indian aspirants who would have to first travel to England in order to appear, but would also have to stay in England for extended periods to familiarize themselves with the European culture and the syllabus. तो पढ़ाई करने के लिए भी इंग्लैंड जाना पड़ेगा और एग्जाम देने के लिए भी इंग्लैंड जाना पड़ेगा. On the other hand, a European aspirant who has grown up within that system would be much better suited to succeed within a heavily Europeanized curriculum. So, Indianization of the syllabus. Fourthly, they demanded a reduction in land revenue. Since the burden was unbearable and it was causing chronic poverty, which was resulting in frequent famines, they wanted relief for the peasantry from the heavy burden of taxation. Similarly, they demanded protection for Indian industries How? By increasing import tariffs and by regulating the exchange rate to favor Indian exporters, right? So this would not only shield the young Indian industries from foreign competition, it would also make their exports more profitable. So there would be an incentive for Indian industries to invest their wealth and expand the industrial machinery of India. Okay? Further, they demanded a reduction in the military and administrative expenditure. Right? Now, military expenditure and administrative expenditure are two kinds of unavoidable expenditures which are not actually very productive because they do not yield any multiplier effect. So this is like a sunk cost जिसके ऊपर कोई return नहीं मिलता है. बट दे आर कंपल्सरी. लेकिन फायदा तब होगा जब आप मिनिमल कॉस्ट में ये अपने एक्सपेंडिचर्स या ड्यूटीज को फुलफिल कर. सो दैट इज व्हाट दे वर डिमांडिंग. To reduce the military expenditure, they demanded the end of overseas deployment of British Indian soldiers. They wanted Indian soldiers to be used for the defense of India only. Secondly, they also demanded the diversion of Indian surplus for British military overseas. So India से जो surplus cloth है, surplus grain है, that was being shipped out regularly. Thirdly, they also wanted to end one major source of home charges, that was military expenditure incurred on behalf of the British Indian Army by the British government overseas. तो ब्रिटेन में मिलिट्री स्टोर्स को परचेज करते थे और बिल भरना पड़ता था इंडियन टैक्स पेयर को. हाँ, वो साजो सामान इंडियंस को मिलता था लेकिन इंडिया के डेवलपमेंटल प्रोसेस में कहीं कंट्रीब्यूट नहीं करता था. To reduce administrative expenditure, they wanted Indianization of the civil service and they also wanted better efficiencies in government expenditure. So they wanted public oversight, legislative oversight, financial oversight over government expenditure. Okay? So that is how they demanded better economies in military and administrative expenditure. And जो पैसा बचा है उससे क्या करना चाहिए? To invest in social sector spending, right? They wanted an increase in social sector spending, mainly health and education में. ठीक है? And finally, they wanted to check the drain of wealth from India to Britain. By checking the various routes for this drain, such as home charges or direct plunder or unrequited exports, etc. ठीक है? So these were the major demands and objectives of British rule. Now, the nature of these demands gives us certain insights into the nature of moderate politics, their attitude towards the British, and the perception that the moderates had towards the British rulers. Right? Now, further you can write, these demands reveal the following. These demands reveal the following. इसमें कोई ऐसी डिमांड है जो कि क्लास स्पेसिफिक, रीजन स्पेसिफिक या रिलीजन स्पेसिफिक है? नहीं. If they have raised the demands of the peasants, they have also raised the demands of the industrialists. They have also raised some general demands. They want better economies, for example. Thus, these demands tell us that the moderates had a secular all India outlook. Secular all India outlook. None of their demands, write down same point, none of their demands was specific to any region, religion, linguistic community, or class. ठीक है? In the overall scheme of things, how would you characterize these demands? As forward looking and progressive, or as backward looking and traditionalist? Forward looking and progressive. These were liberal demands since they were inspired by the ideals of Enlightenment philosophy. Enlightenment stood for all these things. ठीक है? And they wanted to model the Indian society and the Indian political machinery in accordance with the ideals of Enlightenment. So write down. The moderates had a liberal and progressive agenda. Full stop. They were inspired by the values of the Enlightenment. They were inspired by the values of the Enlightenment. And desired to shape Indian politics, and society in line with these values. In line with these values. In line with these values. ठीक है? What does this tell us about the attitude of the moderates towards the British? ये डिमांड्स क्या बताती हैं हमको कि मॉडरेट्स अंग्रेजों को किस तरह से देखते थे? They believed in the providential nature of British rule. They did not want to end British rule in India. They simply wanted to reform British rule in India. So these demands also show their pro-British attitude. The moderates had a pro-British outlook. Rather than demanding the end of British rule, they demanded its reform. This shows that they believed that British rule was inherently beneficial for Indians. That British rule was inherently beneficial for Indians. ठीक है? और क्या बताता है डिमांड्स मॉडरेट्स के बारे में? बताइए. हाँ हाँ, so they had a scientific and a rational approach towards Indian problems. Now, these demands in themselves were not moderate. अगर ये demands actually fulfill हो जाती तो Indians की सारी problem खत्म हो जाती. So it also tells us that the moderates could perceive the true character of Indian suffering, the root cause of Indian suffering. केवल उनके अप्रोच में फ्लॉ था क्योंकि they had misperceived the real nature of British rule. Write down. On the other hand, the moderates had a rational outlook of Indian problems. They were able to pinpoint the root causes of Indian suffering. The root causes of Indian suffering. And their only flaw was their misperception of the nature of British rule. Was the misperception of the nature of British rule. ठीक है, तो ये हो गई the demands and objectives of the moderates, and what do these demands reveal to us about the moderates. Next we have the nature of moderate politics. ठीक है. Now, certain facts we already have about the moderates, that they were not full-time politicians. Rather, politics was a kind of patriotic service that they were rendering to the people by taking time out of their very packed schedule. So this time was also very precious and providing a kind of national service. Secondly, they were admirers of British parliamentary politics, and thus the parliamentary method of politics was also very attractive to them. तो हमें क्या देखने के लिए मिलेगा? That the moderates conducted their politics through annual sessions of the Congress. These sessions would not be held throughout the year. तो जैसे अभी पार्लियामेंट के 3 सेशंस लगते हैं साल के अलग अलग पोर्शंस में, उस तरह का पॉलिटिक्स नहीं होता था. बट बिकॉज दे हैड लिमिटेड टाइम, तो साल के एंड में, इन द लास्ट 3 days of December, right? So write down. The Congress held annual sessions at the end of every year where leaders from across the country would take time out of their busy schedules to congregate and discuss pressing issues. ठीक है, सब पॉइंट लिखो. पार्लियामेंट्री प्रोसीजर was strictly followed. Parliamentary procedure was strictly followed. Write down. Next point. In the first sitting, a president and secretary were elected. इनका काम क्या होगा? To preside over the entire session and to decide कि कांग्रेस का इस साल का एजेंडा ऑफ डिस्कशन क्या होगा. राइट. सो कौन से रेजोल्यूशंस हम इंट्रोड्यूस कर सकते हैं, which questions would be allowed, which questions would be barred, etc. Right. They next point, decided the agenda of the Congress or rather agenda of the Congress नहीं, agenda of the session लिखो. The agenda of the session. Now they were the ones who admitted different resolutions to be open for discussion and अलग अलग members को, delegates को time allot किया जाता था to express their views. So a deliberative process was part and parcel of the functioning of the Congress from the very beginning. Write down. Deliberation was an essential part of the Congress methodology. And once the agenda has been entirely discussed, it would be put to vote. Resolutions were then voted upon and modified if necessary. ठीक है. And then finally, at the end of the session, an annual resolution would be prepared and put to vote. Okay, so on the basis of the deliberations and the different resolutions that have been adopted by the Congress in its various sittings, एक overall annual resolution prepare किया जाता था जिसके ऊपर voting होती थी, right? Now based upon this annual resolution, based upon this, several requests, petitions, memoranda, and protests were drafted. ठीक है, so this resolution consisted the basic demands of the Congress for the coming year, and demands किसके लिए होंगी? सरकार से होंगी. So in the form of different requests, petitions, memoranda, petitions, protests, etc. These were drafted and sent to the concerned authority at the appropriate time. ठीक है, तो अगर ऑल इंडिया डिमांड है तो गवर्नर जनरल को होगा. इफ अ डिमांड पर्टेन्स टू अ पर्टिकुलर प्रोविंस तो उस प्रोविंशियल गवर्नर को होगा. इफ इट पर्टेन्स टू अ पर्टिकुलर डिस्ट्रिक्ट तो वहां के डिस्ट्रिक्ट मजिस्ट्रेट, डिस्ट्रिक्ट ऑफिसर के लिए ये ड्राफ्ट भेज दिया जाएगा, राइट? फर्दर लिखो नेक्स्ट सब पॉइंट. द मेजर डिमांड्स were also published through newspapers. Were also published through newspapers. Clear है इतना? Now ये तो हो गया द मेथड ऑफ वर्किंग ऑफ द कांग्रेस. क्या देखने के लिए मिला हमको कि पार्लियामेंट्री प्रोसीजर को स्ट्रिक्टली फॉलो किया जाता था एंड एनुअल सेशन जो है वो पीरियोडिकली होते थे एट द एंड ऑफ एवरी ईयर. तो रेगुलर पॉलिटिक्स का जमाना अभी तक नहीं आया था. एंड फाइनली थ्रू द प्रोसेस ऑफ डेलिब्रेशन कांग्रेस का एजेंडा सेट किया जाता था एंड देन जो रेजोल्यूशन पास हुआ उसके बेसिस पर रिक्वेस्ट, पिटिशंस, मेमोरेंडास एंड प्रोटेस्ट्स वर lodged and major demands were even published in the newspapers. Then another prominent character of moderate politics was its elite and urban character. Write down. Moderate politics had a distinctly elite and urban character. Distinctly elite and urban character. सब पॉइंट लिखो. Congress members came exclusively from the upper middle class, came exclusively from the upper middle class, including prominent lawyers, doctors, journalists, and educators. Next subpoint. The masses neither had any representation, nor had any participation in the political process. Next subpoint. The moderate movement was limited to the cities alone. The moderates had the moderates had no presence in the villages, nor did they desire to engage the rural masses. ठीक है, थर्ड लिखो, नंबर 3. The moderates felt that the masses of India were not yet ready for political action. Subpoint. They considered them to be uneducated and illiterate, superstitious and conservative, feudal and parochial. Full stop. Thus, their participation in democratic politics would have a counterproductive effect. Democratic politics would have a counterproductive effect. Next sub point. Instead, they believed in educating and modernizing the masses. In educating and modernizing the masses. Right? But what was the disadvantage of not engaging the masses? The social base of the movement remained very narrow, and the moderates were never able to realistically exert any real pressure upon the British. Okay? Their politics remained ineffective. Next sub point. However, due to this attitude, the social base of their movement remained narrow. The social base of their movement remained narrow, and their politics remained ineffective. Their politics remained ineffective. Okay? Now, the moderates had, since their very earliest age, been admirers of Western culture. They were deeply steeped in Western ideology. They had grown up either in the West or learning about the West constantly. They had come to admire the Western institutions. They believed that Western institutions would succeed in India only and only if they are given an opportunity to succeed. They saw themselves as the role models of British Indian citizens. So केवल Indian citizens नहीं है, they saw themselves as the cutting edge of modernity in India, and thus they perceived themselves as the biggest champions of Western ideology, Western institutions. Are they ever going to try and disrupt these Western institutions? नहीं, केवल उन्हीं को रिफॉर्म करने की कोशिश करेंगे. Therefore, do you think that they are ever going to adopt any non-constitutional, extra-constitutional methods? Write down. Next. Number 4. The moderates believed in the constitutional method of politics. Believed in the constitutional method of politics. ठीक है? Sub point. These included prayers, petitions, protests, memoranda, etc. Next sub point. This was because they were admirers of constitutionalism and Western liberal institutions. This was partly the reason why they stayed away from mass politics. Partly the reason why they stayed away from mass politics. Okay? Because mass politics would have involved extra constitutional methods of struggle, such as rallies, disruptions, etc., boycotts, passive resistance. Clear? Now, the younger generation of nationalists who emerged from the beginning of the 20th century onwards, हम extremists की बात कर रहे हैं, they criticize the moderate methods and moderate politics, the moderate leaders and moderate demands as a form of political mendicancy. ठीक है? So later nationalists criticized the moderate method as a form of political mendicancy. As a form of political mendicancy. ठीक है? mendicancy का मतलब क्या होता है? भीख मांगना, right? They criticize the moderates for their loyalty to the British, for their weak kind of politics. However, this criticism overlooks certain important facts. Write down sub point. However, we must remember that moderates were the pioneers of their field. ठीक है? So they were the first to introduce modern politics at an all India level. तो जब पहली बार कोई चीज करते हो तो किस प्रोसेस के थ्रू अंडरगो करना पड़ता है? द प्रोसेस ऑफ ट्रायल एंड एरर, एक्सपेरिमेंटेशन. And it is only after this process of experimentation that your mistakes become apparent to you and you can make certain changes to your approach. But without this process of experimentation, would it be possible to arrive upon the correct approach? Nahi. So they were performing an essential service for the future generation of nationalists. Secondly, simply because their methods appeared weak to the later generation of the extremists, they could not be considered to be unpatriotic and wholly loyalist to British rule. Their demands as well as their constant advocacy for Indian interests indicates that they were in fact deeply patriotic. So they have also been misunderstood. Or if we were to be more cynical, mischaracterized by the later generations. Thirdly, had the moderates adopted an extremely radical stance in the very beginning, would the British have allowed this infantile movement to survive? They would have ruthlessly crushed it, like they had crushed all the previous rebellions before it. Okay? So thus, we can also say that at a certain level, it was also a strategic decision to adopt the moderate methods. And finally, we must also remember that these were individuals who were heavily westernized from the very beginning, and thus moderate methods came naturally to them. Was also a natural choice for the moderates. So to characterize them as political mendicants would be a little bit unfair. Clear? We must remember that the moderates were the pioneers of their field. Next sub point likho. Understandably, they would have to undergo a period of trial and error. Period of trial and error. Full stop. In this scenario, comma, the moderates should be evaluated more leniently. ठीक है? Next sub point. Characterizing the moderates as loyalist and unpatriotic elements would be a gross mischaracterization. Moderates as loyalist and unpatriotic elements would be a gross mischaracterization. Since their entire career was dedicated towards the well-being of all Indians. Next sub point. Adopting moderate methods was also a strategic choice. For the early leaders, as the British were unlikely to tolerate for the early leaders as the British were unlikely to tolerate for the early leaders as the British were unlikely to tolerate a more radical approach. Full stop. British repression would have completely smothered SMOTHERED. Would have completely smothered the nascent NASCENT, the nascent national movement. And next sub point likho. The nascent national movement. Nascent matlab infantile or infant national movement. The nascent national movement. Next subpoint. Since the moderates had been trained in the Western method, and had grown up to admire Western society, comma, moderate politics came naturally to them. Moderate politics came naturally to them. ठीक है? Next सब point लिखो. Therefore, calling the moderates political mendicants would be historically unfair. ठीक है? And lastly, evaluation of the moderate phase. तो हम उनके सक्सेसेस और लिमिटेशंस के बारे में यहाँ बात करने वाले हैं, राइट? Now, did the moderates succeed in fulfilling their demands? नहीं हुआ, right? So write down. The moderates failed to fulfill any of their major demands. Write down. This was due to the following limitations. क्या क्या? Their elite urban movement had a narrow social base. ठीक है? Next sub point. Their unwillingness to involve the masses meant that they were never in a position to pressurize the British. They were never in a position to pressurize the British. Next sub point. Their constitutional methods did not cause or their constitutional methods were unable were ineffective in convincing the British to introduce reforms. And lastly, their failure to perceive the true character of British rule emerged as their greatest weakness. They continued believing that the British are going to fulfill their demands willingly, right? Voluntarily. इनको ये नहीं समझ में आ रहा था that the British rule was inherently exploitative and इनसे जो भी डिमांड्स एक्सट्रैक्ट करवानी होंगी वो छीन के लेनी पड़ेगी. अंग्रेज अपने आप से कुछ नहीं देंगे. Write down same point में ही. They continued believing that the British would fulfill their demands willingly. But in reality, any progress would have to be fought for. Any progress would have to be fought for. ठीक है? Next point, number 2. Next main point. Extremist nationalists criticized the moderates as political mendicants. ठीक है? तो यहाँ पे वही वाले हमको आर्गुमेंट्स करने पड़ेंगे जो प्रीवियस सेक्शन में किए थे. ये पॉलिटिकल मेंडिकेंसी का एक फॉर्म था. दिस पॉलिसी वाज ऑलवेज वीक. इट बिट्रेड अ पोजीशन ऑफ वीकनेस. दे accuse the moderates of being unpatriotic and completely entirely loyalist. However, reality कहीं और है. तो देखो हमने शुरू किया है by discussing the limitations of the moderates. Then we are going to try to justify the actions of the moderates. And having done this, तो यहाँ पे वही वाले जो आर्गुमेंट से पहले आपने लिखे हैं, तो you can write brackets में as discussed above. And then इसके बाद हम क्या कर सकते हैं? We can highlight some of the successes of the moderate phase. Right? आगे लिखो. Finally, we should not overlook the significant achievements of the moderates. ठीक है, तो क्या है इनके सिग्निफिकेंट अचीवमेंट्स? फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल, they were the torch bearers of Indian nationalism. ठीक है, तो इंडियन नेशनलिज्म वाज समथिंग दैट इवॉल्व ओवर अ वेरी लॉन्ग पीरियड ऑफ टाइम, लेकिन शुरुआत यहीं से होती है. हैड इट नॉट बीन फॉर द मॉडरेट्स, प्रॉब्ली नेशनलिज्म इतनी तेजी से और जिस फॉर्म में, जिस तरह का नेशनलिज्म इमर्ज हुआ, वैसा नहीं होता. राइट डाउन. through their through their contributions through their contributions through their contributions, they ensured that the Congress emerged as a secular, all India progressive and democratic platform. ठीक है, तो अर्ली डायरेक्शन कांग्रेस का इन्होंने ही एस्टैब्लिश किया, एंड फ्रॉम द बिगिनिंग टू द एंड द कांग्रेस हेल्ड ट्रू टू ऑल दीज आइडियल्स. इसका नतीजा क्या निकला? दैट कांग्रेस was able to gain legitimacy. People looked towards the Congress with hope. They believed that the Congress is the only Indian political organization which has the ability to lead them, guide them towards independence, greater autonomy, a better life. And thus, because of this legitimacy, the Congress's effectiveness was also enhanced. It was only because it was perceived as the legitimate representative of all Indians, irrespective of their religion, language, or region, that the masses were ready to respond to the calls of the Congress leadership. And it was this mass participation, this mass trust, confidence that transformed the Congress into an effective advocate of national interests. ठीक है, एक तो ये हुआ. And secondly, since the Congress was in the leadership of the national movement as a whole, ये values जो हैं इंडियन नेशनलिज्म और नेशनल मूवमेंट की ही कोर वैल्यूज बन गई. राइट. सो हैड इट नॉट बीन फॉर द मॉडरेट्स, maybe India would have been highly communalized. Maybe if the leadership, which had originally hailed primarily from Bengal, was representing the interests of only Bengal, the geographical integrity of future India would have been harmed. Right. ये भी possibility हो सकता था. So write down. इसके आगे लिखो नेक्स्ट पॉइंट. दिस ट्रांसफॉर्म्ड द कांग्रेस. सब पॉइंट, नेक्स्ट पॉइंट, नेक्स्ट पॉइंट. एक सब पॉइंट लिखा है ना, दूसरा. दिस ट्रांसफॉर्म द कांग्रेस इनटू अ लेजिटिमेट रिप्रेजेंटेटिव ऑफ ऑल इंडियंस and vastly enhanced its effectiveness in the later stages. Vastly enhanced its effectiveness in the later stages. ठीक है? Next sub point. Additionally, these values became the core values of the Indian national movement as a whole, and were crucial for defining our national identity, and were crucial for defining our national identity. ठीक है? नेक्स्ट लिखो नंबर 2. Now, although the moderates failed, their failure was not a complete one, because with their failure, the Indian national movement did not die. Rather, it was forced to evolve. है ना? So, because of their failure, the younger generation of nationalists were forced to experiment with new methods of struggle. And this resulted in the emergence of the extremist ideology. Right? And because of this, a new energy, new methods, new groups, and new people became part and parcel of the national movement. Write down. While the moderates failed in their immediate objectives, their failure was not an absolute one. In their immediate objectives, their failure was not an absolute one. Their failure was not an absolute one. Full stop. Subpoint. Frustrated with the ineffectiveness of the moderate methods, younger nationalists frustrated with the failure of the moderate methods, younger nationalists were forced to turn towards the extremist ideology. Which infused a new energy, along with new methods, demands, and a new strength. ठीक है? तो एनर्जी ऑफ द मूवमेंट चेंज्ड, प्रो ब्रिटिश से अब एंटी ब्रिटिश हो गया, डिमांड्स चेंज, कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल रिफॉर्म से स्वराज हो गया, मेथड्स चेंज, कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल मेथड से पैसिव रेजिस्टेंस हो गया, एंड न्यू स्ट्रेंथ, अर्बन एजुकेटेड एलिट, अपर मिडिल क्लास से कई क्लासेस, लोअर मिडिल क्लास, दी वर्किंग क्लासेस एटसेट्रा, सब लोग इसमें अब इन्वॉल्व हो जाएंगे. ठीक है? तो while they failed, their failure was not an absolute failure. And third लिखो, the most significant success of the moderate leadership was their economic critique of British rule. Was their economic critique of British rule. ठीक है, क्या किया इन्होंने? They studied the functioning of the colonial economy in a scientific manner, and they were able to prove that it is not because of the actions of individual British officials in India that India is poor. Rather, the machinery itself is designed to drain wealth from India and ship it off to Britain. So the colonial machinery was inherently exploitative. ऐसा इन्होंने साइंटिफिक मैनर में साइंटिफिक स्टडी के थ्रू प्रूव किया. Among them, the chief individuals involved were Dadabhai Naroji, M.G. Ranade, and R.C. Dutt. They wrote extensively on this issue, right? So write down subpoint. Their scientific appraisal of the colonial economy, their scientific appraisal of the colonial economy proved that it was inherently exploitative. It was inherently exploitative. Full stop. Next subpoint. They showed how the colonial system was designed to strip India of its wealth. Full stop. In fact, the phrase drain of wealth was coined by the moderate leaders to refer to this phenomenon. ठीक है. Next subpoint. Among the moderates, Dadabhai Naroji, M.G. Ranade, and R.C. Dutt were the most prominent economic critics, most prominent economic critics of British rule. Next subpoint. They exposed the inherently exploitative character of British rule. They expose the inherently exploitative character of British rule and thus shattered the illusion shattered the illusion of British providentialism. British providentialism. ये क्या आइडिया है? That British rule is beneficial for India, that the British are interested in the welfare of Indians. They are ruling India in order to provide a better governance as well as bring about modernization of India, right? तो ये वाला जो मिथ था, जो moderates खुद ही सब्सक्राइब करते थे, they were able to shatter it, but not for themselves. इनके आंखों के सामने जो पर्दा पड़ा हुआ था वो अभी तक इंटैक्ट रहा. जो असलियत है वो किसको समझ में आई? जो यंगर जनरेशन ऑफ नेशनलिस्ट, जो कि एक्सट्रीमिस्ट हुए. नेक्स्ट पॉइंट, नेक्स्ट सब पॉइंट लिखो. दिस played an important role. This played an important role in the upsurge of extremist nationalism, from the early 20th century onwards. From the early 20th century onwards. ठीक है? Now the moderate leaders themselves had built upon the research done by Marx and other Marxist scholars who had criticized the exploitative nature of colonial economy. Okay? And therefore, the writings of the moderates are going to become the inspiration for the future generation of Marxist scholars, both in India as well as abroad. Next sub point likho. Further, the writings of the moderate leaders, inspired further research from later Marxist scholars, full stop. This resulted not only in the growth of the socialist ideology within the national movement, but also within the national movement. तो बाद में socialist ideology भी emerge हुआ ना, तो they were also the intellectual successors of these moderates in this respect, but also in the emergence of the Marxist school of studies, of studies. फॉर एग्जाम्पल मार्क्सिस्ट स्कूल ऑफ हिस्टोरियोग्राफी, मार्क्सिस्ट स्कूल ऑफ सोशल स्टडीज एटसेट्रा, तो जितने भी ह्यूमन साइंसेस वहां पे सब में एक मार्क्सिस्ट अप्रोच भी इमर्ज होगा बाद में. इज दिस क्लियर? तो दीज आर दी successes and failures of the moderates. Now, although the moderates were not able to convince the British to pass any major reforms, some minor reforms were granted. Write down. While none of the major main point, while none of the major moderate demands, while none of the major moderate demands were fulfilled, comma, some minor reforms were secured. Some minor reforms were secured. These include, these include, number one, the Indian Councils Act 1892. प्रोविजंस इसके इंपॉर्टेंट नहीं है, ठीक है. सेकेंड, the establishment of the Welby Commission on Indian expenditure, 1895. Welby Commission on Indian expenditure. इसके रिकमेंडेशंस थे इंडियनाइजेशन ऑफ सिविल सर्विस एंड रिडक्शन ऑफ मिलिट्री एक्सपेंडिचर. एंड thirdly, the appointment of a public service commission in 1896 to do what? To study the feasibility of conducting simultaneous examinations in England as well as India. इस कमीशन ने रिकमेंड किया कि feasible नहीं है, but later on in 1922 finally civil service examinations were conducted simultaneously in Britain and India. ठीक है. तो लेकिन जो प्रेशर डाल रहे थे मॉडरेट, जो अपील्स कर रहे थे, they were successful but to a very minor degree. तो हम इनको भी मेंशन कर सकते हैं उनके अचीवमेंट्स में. लेकिन इनका सबसे बड़ा अचीवमेंट क्या है? their economic critique of British rule and their role in instigating the extremist ideology, apart from establishing the real orientation of nationalism from the very beginning, securing legitimacy and ensuring its later ensuring the later effectiveness of the Indian National Congress. तो ये इनके मेजर अचीवमेंट्स हो जाएंगे, ये माइनर अचीवमेंट्स हो जाएंगे. क्लियर? Take down a question. Critically evaluate the contributions of the moderate leaders within the national movement. Full stop. (200 words, 15 marks. Next question. The moderate methods were bound to fail. Critically discuss. $200 words, 15 marks. दोनों में आंसर सिमिलर रहेगा. Critical evaluation करना है contributions of the moderates that we have addressed directly. Second question, moderate methods were bound to fail, so you have to showcase the inherent weaknesses in the moderate methods. So सबसे बड़ा इनका mistake क्या था? Their inability to perceive the true character of British rule, and because of that their response to British rule was also flawed. तो सबसे पहले तो दिक्कत वहीं से आती है. Secondly, because of this misperception, this flawed interpretation of British rule, they adopted constitutional methods. They एक दूसरा mistake क्या किया इन्होंने? That they never tried to pressurize the British by involving the masses. Their attitude towards the masses was another big mistake. So yes, they were bound to fail in achieving their immediate objectives. However, कुछ mitigating factors भी थे. तो ये इसको पढ़ के ऐसा लग रहा है that moderate methods were a simple choice, was a matter of choice for the moderate politicians. ये नहीं बता रहा है कि it was a complex situation, the nationalism was still in its early stages, so it was a strategic decision to adopt moderate method. Secondly, this assessment also overlooks the significant achievements of the moderates, so उनको भी आपको यहाँ पे highlight करना पड़ेगा. ठीक है, that is how you are going to approach this. तो ये हो गए moderates. Next we have the extremists. ठीक है, तो आज हम लोगों के पास टाइम नहीं है, और तो वी आर गोइंग टू कवर दिस टुमारो, और कल हम स्वदेशी मूवमेंट और सूरत स्प्लिट को भी कवर करने की कोशिश करेंगे. ठीक है, सो वंस अगेन आई विल ट्राई टू सेंड द नोट्स इन एडवांस. कल देख करके आइएगा. चलिए देन, थैंक यू फॉर योर टाइम गाइज. कल मिलते हैं.